My name is Zain Motani. I'm one of the co-founders of NIL 360. Very excited to talk NIL with this group over the course of the next 30 minutes or so. A couple of things we're going to do over the next 30 minutes. The first is we'll walk a little bit through kind of the background of what led up to NIL becoming a thing on July 1st, 2021. We'll talk about NIL State of the Union today and what the future of NIL could entail. We'll talk about why NIL education is so paramount for not only student athletes, but for students who want to work in sports. We'll talk about this NIL 360 product, and then we'll finish with a live demo of the platform. Like Ryan mentioned, I definitely want this to be an interactive discussion. I don't want this to necessarily be one way. So if you have any comments, questions, ideas, please feel free to share them in the chat, and then Ryan will interject with them. But you all had submitted what you were most looking forward to cover during the webinar, during the registration process. So we're going to try to hit on as many of those themes as possible. Does that sound good to everyone? Cool. So I want to spend just a minute on kind of the history of NIL, and then we'll spend much more time talking about the future of NIL and then NIL education. But NIL became permissible July 1st, 2021. And what you see on the screen are some of the milestones that led up to that date. I want to focus on one thing that happened in 2019. So LeBron James and Governor Newsom signed a bill into law in California that would allow college athletes in the state to start getting paid for their NIL, but it wasn't set to go into effect until January 1st, 2023. Well, a bunch of other states saw this happen and said to themselves, we can't have California have this disproportionate advantage for recruiting and retention. So other states, mainly in SEC country, started passing their own bills that turned into law for NIL. And the difference between their legislation and California's legislation was their legislation was set to go into effect on July 1st, 2021. So while this was happening, the NCAA realized we can't have this incongruence. We can't have 8 states that allow NIL as a recruiting and retention tool, and the other 42 states are kind of caught off guard. That's just going to cause disconnects in the entire college sports landscape. So the day before July 1st, 2021, the NCAA adopted a very simple interim NIL policy that would allow all college athletes, regardless of sport, regardless of their division, to get paid for their NIL. And we'll talk about what the definition of NIL is here in a few minutes. Some of the other major events that have happened since 2021, there have been states that have continued to pass their own NIL laws in the absence of federal legislation. And then the news that probably most of this group is familiar with is last summer, the House settlement was passed, which allows schools to pay athletes directly to supplement kind of their traditional name, image, and likeness initiative. So I'll hit on maybe some of the bigger news items over the course of the last 4 years with NIL. The first is collectives have really entered and been very prevalent in the landscape. Collectives started popping up in early 2022, and collectives are these donor-led groups where they kind of pool money and create additional NIL opportunities beyond commercial NIL opportunities. And many skeptics have pointed to collective activity as kind of, hey, this is kind of ruining college sports because it's introducing a pay-to-play debate. Collectives have been something that's been at the top of the mind for the NCAA. Even the IRS in June of 2023 had to call out that donations to collectives were not necessarily tax deductible, even though collectives were helping facilitate charitable work. There's still an absence of federal legislation, but we'll talk about this in a few minutes. But what the future of NIL may entail is, I think there's going to be more kind of actual federal legislation, whether it's at the state level or at the federal level, that's actually going to be kind of bipartisan and allow the federal government to support the NCAA, where the NCAA for the last 4 years has been a little bit hands-off on kind of having broad stroke guidance. NIL is not only permissible for all college athletes, but it's also permissible for high schoolers. So back when NIL became a thing, there was only one state that allowed NIL for high schoolers, which was California. And since then, most every state now allows NIL. And it's not uncommon to see top high school recruits that are getting 6-figure, even 7-figure NIL deals before they ever step onto a college campus. And then the other big news item over the last 4 years is the House settlement. which I'll dive more into. So the House settlement, it had really three pillars. I think the first pillar is the one that probably most everyone on this call is familiar with, which is Division I schools have the ability to pay their college athletes up to $20.5 million per year. How that $20.5 million is distributed between sports is entirely at the discretion of the schools. And that $20.5 million is expected to grow 4% over the course of the next 10 years. It's worth noting that this is only applicable for Division I schools, and not every Division I school has opted into revenue sharing. So only about 83% of schools have opted in. All of the big kind of Power 4 schools have, but the Patriot League, the Ivy League, the Naval Academies, these are schools or conferences that have said, hey, we are going to opt out because it's a real financial burden. And if the entire conference does it, then no one kind of has this unfair advantage. The other two components of the House settlement that I think is worth everyone understanding is back payments. So as a part of the House settlement, the NCAA agreed to pay $2.8 billion over the next 10 years to athletes from 2016 to 2024 who kind of missed out on NIL. And where this $2.8 billion is coming from is 40% is going to be a reduction in kind of the operating expenses from the NCAA, and the rest is going to come from a reduction in distributions to member institutions. So this is the schools that are going to be receiving less from the NCAA. And then the final component of the House settlement that doesn't necessarily get talked about as much today is this adjustment from scholarship limits to roster limits. So before, schools had a limit on how many scholarships they could offer. Now they have a limit on how many roster spots you can have per team. Now, the nice thing is, while there's a limit on roster spots, theoretically, everyone can be on scholarship. But this is having a real impact on college sports. So what you see on the screen is a quote from the UNC athletic director, Bubba Cunningham, where he said on a podcast, we've had to cut over 100 roster spots because of the House settlement. So they have 735 athletes now when they had 100 plus more a year ago. But it's interesting to note, of those 735, UNC is only paying about 100 of those, most of those concentrated in men's basketball and football. And again, how the school chooses to distribute the 20.5 million is entirely up to the school. I want to provide some numbers on how big the NIL economy is, just to provide some context. So there's a lot of numbers on the screen. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I think this chart from Open Doors, which they published back last July. So the landscape has developed, and I'm sure the numbers don't look exactly like what's on the screen right now, but you get a general sense of what it entails. Is there's three big buckets of NIL. And I think oftentimes when you see an ESPN headline or you're talking casually about NIL, it may, everyone's lumping in all the dollars into this NIL bucket. Well, really, there's three buckets. The first is commercial NIL. So commercial is traditional kind of brand deals with it could be with the Coca-Colas of the world. It could be with a local pizza shop down the street. Then there's collective deals, which again, collectives became really prevalent starting in 2022. These are donors and boosters that are kind of pooling their funds and supplementing the promises to a student athlete if they come to an institution. So they may say, hey, Zain, if you come to my school, you're going to have to do these 3 meet and greets with fans, but you're going to be able to get paid oftentimes a disproportionate amount for that meet and greet. And then the third bucket is collegiate revenue, which is this revenue sharing bucket that I talked about. And from the chart, you can kind of see what the relative distribution is out of the, call it $3 billion NIL ecosystem of each of these 3 buckets. A number that I do want to spend a minute on is this number here in the top right. There's 35 states with active NIL laws. So the NCAA has provided some guidance on how NIL should operate. The federal government at times has introduced bills that haven't necessarily turned into laws because these bills tend to be very partisan. So they don't necessarily get the support they need. So states have tried to pass NIL laws, oftentimes to become more attractive to players. So I'll give you guys an example. Arkansas last year passed a bill into law that excludes the revenue sharing that a student athlete gets paid from income tax. So if I am a student, if I'm the quarterback at Arkansas and I'm getting paid 200,000, I'm making up numbers, $200,000 from the school, then because Arkansas has this new law that says that that specific income is exempt from income tax, now I can save 4 or 5% off of that 200,000 versus if I was in the state of Alabama, 5% of that, which would be $10,000, is what I would have to pay in taxes. So these are examples of states that have tried to introduce legislation to make their state more competitive in the NIL landscape. I want to talk about kind of three big NIL headlines that are happening right now, and then we'll transition into the future of NIL and then NIL education and why it's so important. But there could have been 10 headlines we picked, but there were three that really resonated. The first was this new $20.5 million line item is now a new expense that overnight these athletic departments, which often, unless you're like an Ohio State or a Texas, oftentimes athletic departments are breaking even, or they need to go to the institution to help cover any deficit they have. So athletic departments, they're looking for new ways to generate revenue. And one way that schools like Utah, Ohio, Boise State, Florida State have started to explore is taking in private equity dollars. So a couple of months ago, Utah took money from Otro Capital, and what they did is it kind of separated out all the revenue generating functions of college athletics. So think ticketing, merchandising, game day experience, and then that became a kind of for-profit entity while the traditional athletics lived in a nonprofit entity. So it was a nice influx of cash that Utah can use to help cover this 20.5 million and all the other operating expenses associated with student athletes getting paid. The second bucket is this College Sports Commission, which was introduced in June of 2025. This was a part of the House settlement. It was meant to be this independent watchdog. And the goal of the College Sports Commission was to be able to review every NIL deal that came in and say, is this a valid NIL deal? Or is this a kind of, is the athlete getting paid a disproportionate amount that's not necessarily commensurate with their market rate? And there's been a lot of criticism of the College Sports Commission. The CEO has come out and said, hey, we weren't necessarily ready for the amount of volume, the amount of deals that are being submitted through NIL Go, because it just exceeded their expectations. They've published data that said 50% of NIL deals that get submitted get cleared within 24 hours. 70% of NIL deals that get submitted within a week get approved and cleared within a week. And you could look at it glass half full and say, oh, that's great, there's such a quick turnaround time. Or you could say, that's not acceptable because 30% of the time an athlete is submitting a deal, like Zain wants to do this NIL deal with Coca-Cola, 30% of the time they're not coming back with approval for Zain until more than 7 days later. And just recently, they upped their threshold to kind of turn off the spigot of how many deals they had to review. So before, any deal more than $600 had to be submitted through the NIL Go platform. That number just a couple of weeks ago bumped up to 2,500. The third big headline, so I talked earlier about kind of the lack of federal intervention. So last month, President Trump hosted a roundtable with a bunch of sports leaders. And then a couple of weeks later, he signed an executive order. This is his second executive order on college sports. And what you see on the bottom right, what you see on the right are some of the things that that executive order focused on. And now an executive order isn't necessarily law, but it's really meant to spur legislation and provide kind of inspiration to committees that, hey, this is strategically important to me. We need federal intervention to help support the NCAA on things like collective involvement, on athletes transferring so much, on roster limits, which are threatening at times Olympic sports and women's sports as well. And kind of the threat that the federal government is able to provide is if this guidance isn't necessarily followed, then we can review kind of what federal funding that an institution is getting.
Zain, Sorry to interrupt. We have a question. Are you aware of any upcoming legislation regarding NIL?
Yeah, so interesting you brought that's a question. So we actually our team the 360 team had a conversation with there's Senator Bill Cassidy. He's a senator from Louisiana, big sports guy, big LSU guy. He is the chair of the Senate Help Committee. The Ian Help stands for education. So shortly after the roundtable, his team put out an RFI where they're trying to collect as much information from industry experts about how to fix college sports. And one of the big components of that RFI is what kind of financial literacy is needed for these student athletes to navigate the NIL landscape safely. So we met with them, and it was interesting to talk about our sort of certification course as a potential solution for any legislation. But it was interesting to hear them think about how do they think about NIL commercial deals different than NIL revenue sharing and kind of what's in their purview. So I feel more bullish now that there's going to be some bipartisan bill that will eventually turn into law than there was at any point over the last 4 years. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of NIL education. For the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to break it up into two groups. One is the student athlete group, and the second is students who want to work in sports one day. For the student athlete group, there's just been a lack of NIL education, plain and simple, because NIL became a thing overnight. The dollar amounts are so big, everyone's navigating this new. So there's not time to necessarily build that NIL education. So a couple of challenges that student athletes have run into is tax obligations. It's appropriate that we're doing this right during tax season. Oftentimes when student athletes are doing these deals, unless they have LLCs, they're independent contractors, which means they're receiving 1099s. So if I do a deal with Coke for $100,000, I'm getting the full $100,000 paid to me by Coke. And the onus is on me to set aside money for taxes. So when tax time comes around, I can pay the whatever 30% of the 100,000 that I got. But athletes, 18-year-olds, aren't necessarily aware of this, and they're going and spending their full amount. And then when the tax bill comes due, they aren't necessarily equipped. Something else that's been problematic for really the last, call it 5 years, is unqualified advisors. So a lot of folks are masquerading as agents, and they're trying to support these student athletes and their families, but they don't necessarily have the qualifications or the education, and oftentimes they're taking advantage of these student athletes. And that's unfortunately garnered many negative headlines. And what you see on the screen is a headline from Louisiana just earlier this week. They introduced a bill where they're trying to crack down on these agents that are acting kind of nefariously, and they're kind of requiring registration and requiring education if you're going to be an agent supporting a student athlete. And then the final big bucket of why NIL education is so important is there's just been a lot of contract confusion. So if you think back to kind of the last 3 months, if you've gone on ESPN.com, seems like every week there's an example of a school and a former athlete, often a quarterback, that are, the school is suing the former player because the player transferred. And there's been disagreements about exit fees and liquidated damages. And the athlete signed a 2-year deal with the school, but they chose to leave after 1 year. So the school is trying to recoup some of the dollars that were paid to the student athlete. And yes, the examples that I have on the screen are more for kind of the top 1% of athletes, but this is happening at the lower levels as well. I want to talk about the importance of NIL education, not necessarily just for student athletes, but for the students who want to work in sports. So we have relationships with a lot of sport management programs, and it's been cool to kind of see the evolution of how they think about NIL. So in the first year of NIL, it was a footnote, something that may come up in a discussion. Now it's becoming, schools are allocating dedicated weeks in their sports marketing and their sports management classes to talk about NIL. And there's some really innovative programs that are going through and building out dedicated NIL classes because there's so much content to cover and there's so much demand. There are schools like what you see on the screen where they are building out dedicated school-specific NIL certification programs because they want their students to be well-equipped when they enter the workforce to talk about NIL in a much more meaningful way above and beyond it being a footnote. What's also been really interesting is now there's dedicated NIL positions that are coming up. Some of them are with athletic departments, but some of them are with standalone agencies. Some are with standalone businesses where the role is, hey, help us educate, help us teach, and help us navigate the NIL landscape safely. What we've seen when we have talked to agencies that we have relationships with is this bullet right here: that employers expect NIL fluency. So we have a relationship with a pretty big time agency, and they told us 3 years ago the way they had it set up is if they had 30 agents, they took 3 of those agents and they kind of siphoned them off and said, you guys are going to be the NIL experts. You're going after NIL eligible athletes and make sure that we're doing things the right way. Now, flash forward 3 years later, they've changed their model to where they're not siphoning off a small cohort to be NIL experts. Now, everyone, all of the agents, all of those 30 agents need to have a baseline understanding and oftentimes an expert level of understanding of NIL in order for them to navigate their job safely. And it's something that they are now screening for in jobs and internships that they weren't necessarily doing 3 years ago. So we got a couple of minutes left. I want to talk about NIL 360, kind of hopefully the impetus why a lot of folks are here. So we have built this NIL certification course, and this is not just the 3 current events that I talked about. This is not just content on how does a student athlete grow their social media following or how do they outreach to brands. Those are components of what's covered in the course, but it's a really much more robust soup to nuts history of NIL, data points of NIL, high school NIL, what the future of NIL may entail, NIL legislation. What are some interesting statements that the NCAA has made about NIL? How does the federal government intervention in 2026 differ than what it was doing in 2025? So it's a really robust kind of soup to nuts snapshot of the background, the current state, and the future of NIL. And in a minute, I'll do a quick demo of what the platform entails. We have 6 chapters and we have 70 modules that are built in those 6 chapters. And something that we try to really take pride on is making sure that the content is never getting antiquated. So this 70 number may be 74 tomorrow, it may be 68. As the landscape develops, at NIL 360, we take great pride in ensuring the information is up to date. So it's accurate for the student athlete, it's helpful for the student who wants to work in sports, and it's helpful for the professor who wants to use this as kind of their textbook of sorts. So pretty much all the stuff that I talked about today is included in that, plus way more that if we had 4 hours of time, I'd love to walk through, but we only have a few more minutes. So at the end of when the students go through the certification course, whether it's a student athlete or a student who wants to work in sports, they get a certification. And this certification signals, hey, I've gone to this extra effort to really become an NIL expert. And this has been tremendously helpful in the past for student athletes who want to showcase to the Coca-Colas of the world, hey, I'm going to be an easy athlete to work with because I have this certification. So I'm coming in and I know how to navigate NIL efficiently. I know how to make it easy for you as the brand. It's been tremendously helpful for athletic departments who are trying to have some sort of differentiated advantage in recruiting and retention above and beyond how many dollars are they going to be able to offer a student athlete. And then it's also been tremendously helpful for students who want to work in sports because they can take this certification, they can put it on their resume, they can put it on their LinkedIn, they can bring it up in their interviews to showcase, I know more about NIL than whatever ESPN is reporting, and I know more than just how do you grow your social media following or how do you shoot really good content. Again, those are very big components of NIL, but they're just a sliver of a bucket of a slice of what's included in our course. So we have a couple minutes left. I'm going to change screens and I'm going to do a quick demo of what our certification course, NIL 360, actually entails. And then as I'm doing that, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and then Ryan will make sure to bring them up. But if everyone can see my screen, so this is kind of what the student view of the certification course would entail. I'm just going to click into a random module. This chapter is called NIL legislation and the future of NIL. So it's a little bit more kind of technical and granular. but you can kind of see the content that we cover. So we have content, we have supporting links, we have visuals, we have audio snippets, we'll have video snippets. Sometimes something we try to be is we want to meet the modern learner where they are. We've heard a ton that, hey, our students aren't necessarily, some of them are going to read a lot of text, but it's going to resonate more if we have videos. So in our course, we have custom built videos that support the text that we've put together. Sometimes it's an example, sometimes it's a supplement, sometimes it's a complement to the text that the student is actually going to read. So between the video snippets, the audio snippets, the text, the supporting documentation, the supporting links, our hope is that a student, for example, would be able to come in, understand why did Miami get sanctions from the NCAA, why they were the first school, what were the learnings, what were the penalties, and how did it shape how student athletes and programs like navigated NIL going forward in a very digestible way. And what you can see on the screen is I'm not going to go through all of them, but just some of the other modules that we have in this chapter. And again, as there's new news in the NIL landscape, we're always going through and updating this content. And at the end of each one of the chapters, there is a quiz. I'm not going to go through the quiz, but you can kind of get a sense of the type of questions we're asking to ensure that the student that went through it understood at a baseline level the information that was covered. So I know that was a lot of me talking, and we've got a couple of minutes, but hopefully this was helpful to kind of get a sense of the state of union of NIL, why NIL education is so important, and what this NIL 360 course that we've built is, and kind of who the target audience is. So Ryan, would love to hear kind of any questions that came up in the chat that would be helpful to cover in the last couple of minutes.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And please keep those questions coming in. I have a few of them here already. What is the impact of NIL on international students? And is this certification suitable for them as well?
Yeah, so international students, because of kind of the F1 visa they're on, there's kind of nuances of what they can and cannot do. But we do actually have a dedicated module on NIL for international students. And we have examples in the past where there was a Kentucky basketball player in 2022 who was not from the US. His team did a trip to the Bahamas, and his team organized a bunch of NIL deals because he was able to do it in the Bahamas, but wasn't able to do it in the US. So yes, this is relevant for international students who want to understand how can I navigate NIL and what can I do, what can I not do if I'm on an F1 visa while playing ball in the States, while playing a sport in the States.
This professor could see this being used as a recruiting tool for student athletes. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great point, because it's not, before it was an arms race. If I'm making up schools, LSU and Alabama, they're kind of competing on facilities and pedigree and how many players have they sent to the NFL, for example. Now the conversation is much more, how much can you pay me? And that's what a lot of high school and even transfer portal recruits are asking. So from our conversations with athletic departments, they're looking for what are those other small things that are going to resonate with a parents, with a student athlete, and one of being able to say, hey, we offer this certification course. It's included for free for all student athletes, and this will help you when you're trying to navigate a commercial NIL deal or a revenue sharing contract. Is just a feather in the cap that these schools can start bringing up, because they're all trying to compete for the same recruits and trying to differentiate themselves above and beyond. You're going to get paid X dollars if you come to the school.
This instructor simply said her students don't read text. How many videos are embedded within the program?
Yep, great question, and not something. It's definitely something we've heard before. So every one of our, call it 70 modules, has a video. Some of the videos are custom built, some by NIL 360. Some of these are module or videos that are from industry experts like Joe Pomp or Jay Billis, who do a really good job in a digestible period of time explaining what's the actual tangible impact of scholarship limits transitioning to roster limits, and what does that mean for the long-term outlook. So to answer your question more directly, every single one of the modules has either a video snippet or an audio snippet that either complements or supplements or serves as an example of any text that's in that module.
That's great. Are you aware of any state legislations that may limit the number of times an athlete can get into the portal and change or terminate their NIL contracts?
Yeah, so this is actually a big focus of the executive order that President Trump signed a couple of weeks ago. And again, the executive order is not law. It's meant to spur legislative action for the House and the Senate. But in there, there's guidance on how many years the athlete would have for eligibility. But for specifically for transferring, the executive order spells out you would have one transfer without penalty. And then if you transferred again, you would have to sit out a year, which is what kind of the old model was. So it prevents kind of what's happened in the last 5 years, where there have been athletes that have in 5 years played at 5 different schools. And it's not necessarily they're transferring up a level or down a level. It's like all 5 high major schools, and they're just hopping from school to school, oftentimes because they're getting a higher dollar amount from moving to school A, which is on the same level field of school B. So I would expect that the next legislation that comes out has some more formal guidance of how many times these athletes can transfer. And I don't think it'll be kind of as open or liberal as it is right now.
Thank you. We have an attendee here that just started an NIL and athlete brand management class and was wondering how this can be incorporated within their course. And I would assume it's just like adopting a traditional textbook.
Exactly. And with the schools that are incorporating, the certification course, they are using this as their de facto textbook. So they're taking out, call it 2 to 4 weeks of their academic curriculum. And they're saying week 1, we're going to cover this topic of NIL. Week 2, we're covering this topic of NIL. And what they do is they will assign their students a certain number of modules to go through for homework. And then they come to class and they have spirited discussions and debates on the topics or on the content that they read for homework. So for intro to sport management classes, issues in intercollegiate athletic classes, NIL branding classes, all these kind of NIL ancillary class or sport management classes, they're incorporating this content as, yes, they're dynamically updating textbook.
We have time for one more question, which I will answer for you, Zain, unless you want to add to it. But we're getting questions on the cost. The cost is $79 for students. That includes access to the full course and certification. So a great value. And I will add, on Monday, you'll get a link to the recording of this webinar. And during that, in that email, you can schedule a live demo with one of us to get a personalized view of the entire platform. Or if you're interested in a personalized demo now, just reply in the chat function. But on Monday, I'll send a recording of this webinar. And if you're really eager, when you close the webinar window out, you will be taken to the product page where you can click the request more information button. And there you can also learn more about the publication. I appreciate your time today, Zain. This has been a lot of fun.
No, thank you all for having me. I was so jazzed up for this. And as we saw all the questions that folks were asking or professors were asking on the registration form, it was refreshing to be able to talk about not only kind of the state of NIL, but also NIL education.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.